Well, good afternoon to all the colleagues and the students that are joining us. My name is Tom Avermaete, and I'm a professor for the history and theory of urban design at ETH Zurich. And it's a pleasure to welcome you to this new lecture series entitled TACK Talks, How Do We Know? This lecture series is initiated within the context of a larger European research project, which has the name Communities of Tacit Knowledge, Architecture and its Ways of Knowing, and which is supported by the European Framework Program Horizon 2020, and on which you can find more information on our website. Within this research project, no less than 10 PhD researchers explore the specific knowledge that architects use when designing buildings and cities. What is specific for the Communities of Tacit Knowledge project is that the research into tacit knowledge is not only performed is made on an everyday basis. As a result, the Communities of Tacit Knowledge project not only gathers 10 major academic institutions, but also 3 leading cultural architectural institutions, as well as 9 distinguished architecture design offices. And it are precisely these 9 design offices that you will encounter in our TACK Talks in the coming weeks. In this online lecture series, we want to explore how architects know, as you can see from the title of this lecture series, or to say it differently, through which modi operandi architects generate knowledge. In other words, we are interested in the character of tacit knowledge in the field of architectural design, as well as in the various roles that tacit knowledge plays, for instance, as a medium of collaboration with others. The 9 architectural firms will reveal in the following weeks how their work relates to particular articulations of tacit knowledge, but also how tacit knowledge is part of the internal conversation in the office and the communication with others. This lecture series was prepared by Dr. Janina José at ETH Zurich, as well as by Professor Lara Schrijver and Professor Christoph Grafe, who will be co-hosting the various lectures with me. Today, one of the PhD candidates of our research project, Filippo Catapan, has agreed to act as a respondent. You will hear him later. Tacit knowledge in the field of architecture is obviously not a new thing. The question of the nature of tacit knowledge and how it performs might be even as old as architecture. However, it is also clear that the character of tacit knowledge has evolved as the conditions, the approaches, and the tools of architects have changed. I'm therefore very happy to introduce as a first speaker in our series today, Professor Holger Hoffman, who combines in my mind a very strong interest in the history of architecture on the one hand, with what I would call a fascination for the new tools and instruments of contemporary architecture. Holger Hoffman is a registered architect and founder of One Fine Day Office for Architectural Design, which is based in Düsseldorf, Germany. Holger Hoffman holds a professorship for techniques of representation and design at the University of Wuppertal since 2011. And prior to that, from 2007 to 2011, he led the Department for Digital Design at the University of Applied Sciences in Trier, Germany. Holger gained professional experience in very well-known offices like UN Studio in Amsterdam and Bolles & Wilson in Münster. He received a postgraduate diploma in 2004 from the Städelschule in Frankfurt, as he holds also a professional degree in architecture from the Münster School of Architecture in Germany. And before studying architecture, he was trained as a journeyman mason. Holger, I want to wish you a warm welcome to this lecture series, and please take the digital floor.
Thank you, Tom, for inviting me. This is really exciting. This is different than normal lectures, I think, but I think it's an interesting opportunity. So I will share my screen now so that you can see my presentation, which I hope has worked out now. So I'm lucky to be part of this research project. I think it has to do with the fact that my esteemed colleague Christoph Grafe initiated this project also at our university in Wuppertal, where I, as Tom just explained, teach next to our office. I'm doing two things, and I will explain that briefly, that I think are important for the understanding of a whole regarding the work in academia as well as in practice. And I hope that I will manage to explain a little bit how we use those two platforms to understand how we work and why the projects we are doing are the way they are. So first, I would like to mention and show a little bit of our projects in Wuppertal, simply because this is a very important part of our work. We managed to share beliefs and themes between those two platforms, i.e. Wuppertal and our office. And there are similarities in approaches, but there is also specific freedom that we use in the academic environment that we for sure cannot explore so far in the professional environment, simply because the rules there are different. And I'm lucky to work in a team. So as architecture, I think, is always teamwork. I have a team in Wuppertal of people who are very specialized on the one side, who have knowledge that I do not have, who have joined my chair, but who share, let's say, similar interest in diverse the diverse seminars and projects that we teach. The same is for the office. Also at the office, we work in the team. We are very small, we're just 4 people. And here we have to be, it's a very concentrated and very focused, simply because of the size and because of the type of projects that we're doing. But I think also here we share a certain idea and belief in a sort of architecture that hopefully expands a little bit what we normally consider to be a building. So we try to introduce certain narratives, certain links, and a general idea of, let's say, the continuity of architectural development and conceptual development in architecture in most, hopefully all our projects. We have been lucky to be able to build a couple of houses in the past years. Some of them are, let's say, very much linked to also our own becoming as architects, the way we have been educated and the way we have been working. Others are for sure also a little bit more, it's a pragmatic and bound to the very specific environment we're working in right now in Germany. But hopefully all of those projects establish certain relations to the context, meaning the place, but also the context and background of ourselves as being part of a cultural discourse. And this means that our office is hopefully more than just, I would say, a succession of projects, of singular events, but it hopefully is a place where we can explore interests that go beyond a specific singular project. I like to use that diagram that I've been working on during my time at UN Studio in 2005 and 2006 for a publication called Design Models to explain that a little bit. I think I've been interested in the question why we work the way we work and how do we understand ourselves in such processes since some time. And this was a very welcome opportunity to do a sort of, I would say, office archaeology at UN Studio to understand how the office had developed over time. So this is a diagram from the book Design Models that shows a stream of projects over a certain time frame of around 15, 16 years at that time, and how those projects had conceptually influenced each other. And what I found interesting at that time, I don't have the time to now go into the depth of this diagram, but what I found interesting at that time was that there were conceptual ideas that would steer projects that are maybe very different from the project where a specific conceptual idea had developed. So there was the idea that there was a sort of common knowledge established within the office with all the different people and figures that had joined the office over time and had left their traces there that would influence generations to come. I found that very intriguing to see how this, as it was called, united network of specialists, of personalities, developed a tool to basically share conceptual strategies to steer projects and to steer the conceptual development of the office. And also at our office, we try to develop an understanding why the projects are the way they are. And I have to say, I have one infatuation or obsession with rotational geometry that goes back to my studies at Städelschule in Frankfurt with Johann Bettum, and an interest in the work of Robin Evans and the role of geometry, as you could call that, would be operational. So geometry as an engendering force that helps to define the partie of a project. And this is an overview of a couple of projects from our office that I used to use as a comparative study to show how the idea of a pivotal point as an engendering device for the making of architectural geometry has influenced all these projects. So there are a couple of ideas, and this is one of them. This may be very important for us, but there are a couple of ideas that have evolved over time, but that have also been very consistent over the time in our office. I think generally there are two things that interest me during our continuous attempt to understand our own work and the discipline. One, you could say, is the role of the digital in architecture. I think the paradigm shifts, and I think there have been different paradigm shifts since the introduction of the digital or computational design into architecture over decades now. These paradigm shifts have left traces and have widely transformed our practice. And on the other side, there are disciplinary questions. And I think it is good that the digitalization of our discipline has matured so far already that we basically could shift the gaze maybe away a little bit from the infatuation with digital tools towards merely disciplinary questions. However, digital tools still are the base for everything we're doing. So I would like to talk about maybe two things to frame the idea of what knowledge or expertise is in our discipline. One would be expertise / knowledge, and the other one would be the question for technology and techniques. They are both related. I'm very much fascinated by Philip Johnson's Glass House in New Canaan. That was paralleled by a publication in the Architectural Review in 1950. So he would not only build a house, but he would also frame the house with a set of references. This set of references would be either true or, as I just learned, either misleading, deliberately misleading. But these references would embed the project in different streams of the discipline and would create a sense of continuity, not necessarily, I would say, a sense of an avant-garde project, but a sense of continuity of such an architectural project as part of an ongoing development of architecture. And I think it is important to have that knowledge to understand design procedures and to understand the manifestation of architectural projects. This is José Raúl Capablanca. He was a chess player at the beginning of the 20th century. And I always use this image to explain maybe an approach towards expertise also at our university. I took this from Philip Ross from the Scientific American. And in this article, Philip Ross explains how Capablanca would play chess and how this has been researched and how this has been used to understand how the cognitive sciences have developed and how expertise has developed. And the interesting thing about this image, what was a masked chess game in Berlin in 1929, was that Capablanca won all the games he played. And the question how he could basically foresee each and every game was, his answer was that he said, you know, I didn't really calculate too many moves in advance. I just always made the right choice. So my question would be, what enables us as architects so that we can basically make the right choice while we're designing? I think what Capablanca said was half true, because if one then researches his biography, he had been playing chess since he was of young age, as you can see on the right side of the image. And so apparently he had acquired in-depth knowledge regarding his discipline. And I think this is what we need to do at the university as well. So we need to acquire, we need to build up a set of references, precedents, and techniques that basically help us making decisions while we are working. This is something that we do very extensively in Wuppertal, basically recreating, remodeling precedent projects with the students as a sort of a catalog for future projects to come. Not in the sense of, we could say, just copying them, but more as a sense of a, let's say, elastic model, as one could call it. So principles, techniques to basically be translated and furthered in entirely different projects. This, I think, enables us to play. And if I'm correct, then play is part of the word knowledge, so etymologically. And that is what we also do at the university. We use the knowledge that we have gained in reconstructing certain projects, like in this one, Villa Giulia in Rome, in order to, with the technology we have at hand today, which is digital, in this case, it's a virtual reality model. With those modeling techniques, we try to establish continuities between a discipline that is there and maybe an invention that we make. And we do that in many different levels. I hope the video runs. Hope you can see the video. So that's our RoboLab in Wuppertal, where we just did a project over past winter, where we used this technology to explore certain, you could say, Art Nouveau-ish ornamentation techniques. And we used them in relation to that very specific way of producing with styrofoam cutting and milling. And this was a game we played with the students to understand how we could translate certain precedents that we found into architectural form. So there's a relation between the technology that we have at hand today and the techniques that might come from the discipline, that might not just be bound to the digital, but that might be bound to something that is very much pre-digital, which I think is then important to differentiate the idea of technology and techniques. I think that is an old topic. So you could say there's an ideology in architecture, and there are certain techniques that are used to build architecture. And I think there's a continuity here as well. So whether it's Corbusier's Villa Savoie, you could say, as its ideological image and the reality of building that has steered architecture over years. And that has been one cornerstone also that steered our own position towards, for instance, in this case, the role of craft and making in relation to the architectural image. So our first project after having left UN Studio was this one, which was a project in between the university and the office, where we did a research and development project together with the Handwerkskammer Koblenz for the Bundesgartenschau in Koblenz in 2009 to 2011. And this was all about the exploration of, you could say, structural ornamentation and tectonics, and the possibilities of digital fabrication methods. And from this background, from the interest in, you could say, on the one side, the disciplinary one, the role of tectonics in relation to architectural form, and on the other side, the fabrication technologies that we have, we developed a pavilion that was, in a way, based on associative geometry, and on the other side, explored even typological questions. It had to be very rigid, also for budget reasons. So we could not design it as a free form as we could have with the technology we had at hand, but we used it deliberately as a very rule-based system, as we would have called it back then, to explore the relation of fabrication techniques and the effects of the structural ornament. You can see on the right side the script that had been written to actually produce the form. On the left side, you see the result of the structural design model, and we use those two in an iterative way to explore the formal opportunities we would have in this project. This would then be the reality on the side where Ox-Holzbau, the company who built it, would assemble this sort of puzzle to a larger whole. And in here, you would have the integration of digital fabrication techniques with craft. And you would see the traces of this craft everywhere in the pavilion. And that was also important. You could say, in opposition to UN Studios pavilion in Chicago that you just saw, here the idea was to deliberately show the process of making and the tectonics of a digital object. Secondly, there was a deep interest in the, you would say, typology of an exhibition pavilion. And instead of making, you could say, an abstract box that would be able to host very different usages or functions, we try to be very specific in the way these different usages, meaning exhibition, lectures, and workshops, could leave their traces in the typology. And so with this patterned object, I think we found a way to blend the tectonics, the structural ornamentation, and the typology. So such typological research has been very important, you could say, for our own office. And interestingly, this had not been important in the years before. So in the years before, you would say diagramming abstract and maybe diagram abstract relations had been more of an issue than at our own office, where we have made typological questions the key question for the making of projects. So the project you're just seeing is a competition entry that we did in 2013 for the Central Mosque of Pristina, where we literally blended two different typologies of mosques. So one would be a hypostyle typology, the other one would be a central space. And we used a tool or modeling tools, different modeling tools, to explore the options to blend those two typologies into one new sort of mosque that would be both, that would be literally stemming from its historical background, but also would show that it has been generated with contemporary techniques. So this is the Grasshopper script that we used, that transforms, literally transforms the hypostyle array of components, spatial components. These are all walls that can then be, with parametric software, manipulated. What is interesting about this is that it is elastic, so there still is a linear process, but it's maybe less linear than a typical sketching and drawing process might be. So we can, during the process, change the geometry. We can refine the geometry with a recursive script in this case, and then we can change the typology from the hypostyle typology to a central space. And with this, you could say, technology and this technique, we would then produce an object that's at least our argument, very much looks like a mosque, that can be recognized as a mosque, but also has become a project that is, from our point of view, very modern and a very modern version of a historical mosque. Here you can see the interior of the space that hopefully creates a balance between tradition and modernity. And you see it from in top view in the side plan, how this object sits like a strange object in the urban environment. So it hopefully is an object that you recognize as being part of the place, part of the culture, but also an object that maybe even establishes a sort of a critical stance towards the culture it responds to. That is a theme that with this project, I think we have developed for now around 6 years, 6 to 7 years. This is the question of context as a device. I think it took us some time to really understand what we are doing, and I was lucky to have the chance in 2015 and 16 to do 1 year of teaching at Städelschule, where I was confronted with the idea of speculative realism and thoughts regarding a more, you would say, a projective idea of background and context. So with this year of teaching, I think we developed a different reading of those early projects we did. And this is the idea that architectural design methods, such as drawing and representational methods, are not just made to prepare a building to go on site and to be built, but for sure, and that this is a long tradition, as we see here in Canaletto's Capriccio, but these techniques for sure are also techniques to explore and speculate. And in that sense, I very much like the, you could say, the renaissance, I would call it a renaissance of drawing techniques that we're currently seeing next to the simulation techniques that we have in, you could say, rendering techniques, but the idea that there's the drawing as an act of speculation that helps us to introduce a certain degree of speculation to our architectural projects as well, at the university, but also at the office. And I always use these two references for that. So the one is some Jacob Studios collage of the inverted glass house, where he embeds the drawing of Philip Johnson's glass house into Poussin's painting that again is placed, as you can see in the upper image, again is placed within the glasshouse itself. So there's a very interesting relation, as I would say, what is real and what is speculation, and what is the background and what is the context. Same goes for Young and Ayata's still life interventions, who have been a great inspiration for, I think, our work at the university, but also at the office. And the idea of the object that maybe is a deliberate misfit, establishing a sort of critical position towards its background and context. And I would like to show a couple of sketches, or a couple of drawings that hopefully highlight that idea in our own work. One I have shown you with the central mosque, and then there are two more projects that I would like to explain that in different degree, different depth. One is House B, as we call it, is a house nearby Frankfurt. I will show that very briefly and just one piece of furniture that we designed. One is the Schüko Welcome Forum, a project that is just going on site since Monday. And we'll just show one object, which is this stair. And one building I will show a little bit in more detail is Haus H, which is a house that we built in my home region, actually. So in the region where I know the context quite well. And I think what is true for all of those projects is that there are acts of exaggeration, acts of artistic exaggeration that hopefully create this idea of estrangement, or this effect of estrangement, so that makes us aware of the space and the environment we're in. So this is House B, and it builds a lot of relations. So it's part of our research to understand, for instance, how we live and which precedents have left which traces, and how we could use that knowledge to produce an object that is hopefully on the one side contemporary in the use of geometry and maybe even intricate shapes, but on the other side sets up clear relations to, in this case, 20th century modernism. But the reason why I'm showing this is this one piece of furniture, which is a bench that becomes a cupboard. So it uses the split level in the house and the very specific situation as a dining space becoming a living space. So in between those two, and I hope one can see the relation to the references that I have shown. So this is a piece of furniture that hopefully creates a moment of maybe distraction or irritation for the children of that house. I think it creates moments of a lot of fun and play. because it is an object that you would normally not have as a house, because it literally combines two things that are normally discrete objects, and it sets up a very specific relation to the space that spans from the living to the dining in a, let's say, multi-dimensional manner. So this is one object that hopefully creates this moment of being different that is initiated by a specific architectural gesture or object. This is, as said, this is the Schüco Welcome Forum. On the left side, you see the plan from construction documentation plans. And on the right side, you see one element of this plan. It's an adaptive reuse project. So these were two fabrication plants or halls that we transformed into this new building. And as you see in the plan, we work with different angles and also curvilinear form to extend the spatial potential of a just orthogonal object. And one of these objects is this stair that we designed. And during the competition, this stair was much more conventional, you could say. It was still a spiraling stair, but it would not have this cylindrical shape. And it is a quote on, you could say, the transformation of the whole Schüco campus. And it's a comment, a critical comment on that transformation, in which you see a play of lines and curves. And we, you could say, exaggerated this play of lines and curves, where the lines and curves become objects. In this case, they become a cylindrical object that makes this stair a hopefully very unusual space, because normally a stair is a means to go upwards. And in a place like this, you would design the stair so that you experience this space around you. In our case, we block the space around you so that you, let's say, get a moment of, or get a different vision when you enter the gallery at the top, and that you are in an entirely different spatial scenario while you do so. So these are strategies that we use at the office to hopefully build a relation to specific contexts in which we work. And I would like to end my talk with a little bit more in-depth explanation of a project, as said, in my home region. It is a house that we did for a very interested and interesting client. He initiated a small competition that we won. And I think we won it because the project was very context specific. This is a very important mention that is part of that region. And it is the role model, part of the role models that have influenced the shape of this very house that we did. The house is contextual in the sense as it responds to the fact that it is put in the farmland on the one side, but it is farmland that is already inhabited by people who build, you could say, normal houses. And we quote a lot of gestures and forms and motifs of those houses, but we use the technology we have at hand to blend those motifs into a house that is then still slightly different. We have also used an approach towards, again, craft, and the fact that this building has been built in a very traditional manner by a builder who just lives around the corner. So we have used the local materials that are used in that region, but we have also painted that material so that we get this brickwork slightly different than what you might have. Normally, white buildings in that region are just plastered. In our case, it's a little bit more related to maybe a soft modernism of the second half of the 20th century. And then there's the typological research that underlines this project that has to do, on the one side, with the fact that it's a farmhouse, or around that building are a lot of farmhouses. And they are all based on what is called a Vier-Ständer house typology, which is a tripartite, normally tripartite typology. And on the other side, it's a mansion. It's the Landhaus, as we call it in Germany. That is based, again, on the idea of, you could say, a Palladian grid. And those two cornerstones we used to produce a 3x3, 9 square general layout that we would then transform with the technology at hand. And then it is also related to you could say, the origins of our office. And one of these origins is my diploma work that I did for Städtische Architecture class in 2004, and the interest in Robin Evans and the pivotal point, and the interest also already then in the relations between the architectural object and its environment and landscape. So I would say finally we were able to sort of build the diagram you see on the right in a different yet also similar manner. So this is the plan as you see it on the left. If you go into the typology, you will see that we quoted certain local specialities like the main hall in the center, and that we then made a comparably modest house out of it. So you have one, you could say, big detail that is the central space that is very complex, but all other rooms around that are actually quite normal, quite simple. But this very central space that literally evolves around the pivot, that makes the geometry and that makes the space, that is hopefully leads into a also different version of the halls that you normally know, which is called Westfälische Diele in German, that you normally know in that region. That is the house from the outside. Here one can see how the different gables stretch into the landscape. So the house has no back, you could say. It has 4 gable facades, and every facade has a very specific face. And in between, there's an area of transformation that is very literal transformation. And here you see the interior of that space, of that house. That's the central hall, where you can see the relation of that transformed roof at the top and the typology of the central hall in the center. And for sure, such a house needs a fireplace. Also, this house then has a fireplace, as its traditional precedents have it. So the idea again here is the idea of continuity. It is the idea of relating such a house, despite the fact that we might use, let's say, a formal vocabulary that is sort of contemporary, but that we use that vocabulary in a very contextual sense. Here you can see the house from the top. There you see what this roof does with the introduced twist. And you see, hopefully, how this again relates to the type of farmhouse that you have in the region, with its gables and saddle roofs that point into the landscape. And then talking about technology, as I said, we used the, let's say, typical technology that we have at our office at hand, which is often parametric, associative, and generative, to understand that sort of roof, because that was the most complex roof that we have built to date. And we used this technology, for instance, in rainflow diagrams, but also for the making of the roof. So on the left side, you see already a diagram that shows all those beams that we have used to clad the roof. Here you see a diagram that shows the relation of the beams and the wall, and that shows how the relation of the wall and the roof is geometrically. And at that time, one of our partners at the office, Hans-Peter Nünning, who is an absolute specialist in that sort of technology, he developed all those details. And I would argue that such details would only be possible with that sort of technology. So the technology enabled us to respond to context that specifically. Here you can see the roof as it has been built. The upper right image shows the roof during construction, where then the craftsmen would use their ways of directing all those lamellas, who were again then based on a specific joint that our client produced with 3D milling and laser cutting. That was a very complex joint that would need to be positioned underneath each lamella, that would then be directed on top of the roof by the local craftsman again. So I hope I've been able to show briefly, and the 40 minutes are more or less gone already. I hope I've been able to show more or less briefly how this, how the relations between, let's say, local tradition, but also the interest in the development of our discipline, how these relations have formed the work of our office up until today. I think we are what you could probably call still a young office, hopefully. We are definitely a small office, and we see that the projects we have been allowed to build in the last years have allowed us to explore such relations. And I hope that we will be able in the next years to come to explore such relations even further with more and different projects. Thank you very much. Now I think I stop.
Yeah, thank you, Holger Hoffman. Yeah, and I think for a very inspiring talk. I was particularly interested in the context of the theme that we are exploring here. I mean, how do we know that in the last project you were on the one hand insisting on knowing the local culture, the way of dwelling, which transpires in the types of dwellings, let's say, but also the way of building, which transpires in the use of a certain material. But at the same time, also insisting on knowing new technologies, let's say, as you showed us in your last slides. And I think this, let's say, this field of tension maybe, or these two poles of knowing a local culture in its various declinations and knowing a technology as two ways of knowing that in some kind of way are brought together within a single project is a very interesting contribution to our discussion of today as well. I would like now to introduce Filippo Chiatapan, one of the PhD candidates in the program. Filippo, you can activate your video if you want to. Filippo studied at the University of Venice, where he graduated in 2011. And subsequently, Filippo has been a teaching and research assistant at the Politecnico di Milano, at ETH Zurich, and at EPFL in Lausanne. Filippo's research is mainly focused on architectural and urban representation, and particularly focusing on issues such as Renaissance architectura picta, 17th and 18th century visionary engravings, and 1970 collages. And last but not least, since 2016, Filippo has also been working as an architect in the Milano studio of On-Site Studio. Filippo has been so generous, I would say, to take the role of respondent today. So without further ado, Filippo, I'm going to pass the word to you to ask indeed some questions to our speaker of today. So please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Tom, for the introduction. Thank you, Holger, for this very inspiring and very interesting lecture, which, first of all, I think was also very specific for our common research on architectural knowledge and tacit knowledge in particular. I would like to start with that, our discussion. And in particular, I would like to go back to the diagrams that you presented at the beginning. The diagrams which show, I think, a very clear idea of the strategic knowledge which is produced within one fine day practice, particularly in relation to rotational symmetry, which correspond in a way to a very clear and coherent methodological approach. I would like to ask you if could you please comment a bit more on the practical role that this knowledge and these related graphic materials have for your practice. And I'm referring in particular to the early stage phases of the design. So when you have to conceive a new design proposal with your team.
Yeah, maybe I can respond to the importance of that you would say method with a link again to Johann Bettum and the Städelschule, because when I was studying there, he was literally hinting me at Evans' projective cast and Pierrot's you would say elastic tools to basically produce a sort of even associativity between the geometries. And next to that, there was a research on the fireplace actually that I did at Städelschule as a device that would enable space and make space and control space. So there was on many levels there was a research, I would say, design research that I did at that time that then paved the way for the project I did. And the methodology that we developed, or that I developed during this diploma thesis project, proved to be very very powerful for the control of architectural geometry. And what I liked was that you could introduce a degree of asymmetry into a otherwise entirely symmetrical system, because normally, and that's what Evan says, we're normally used to bilateral symmetry. But the introduction of rotational symmetry suddenly enables us to produce buildings that from the outside do not look symmetrical, but however they are. And if we want to build something, even if it, or especially if it's complicated, this is a methodology that actually helps because you have a degree of repetition in the system and you can introduce variation into that system and that helps building something. Everything that you can repeat, I think, is good if one wants to build something. So in that sense, this tool proved to be powerful for the relationality of objects in a project. And I also have to say that this was all during the time when the hybridization was at stake, maybe much more than today. So today, just I think aesthetically, we are looking much more into collage topics and so forth. But at that time, and in the school of thought I was in, I would say hybridization and the polishing of form and the associativity of geometry, that was the, I would say, key issue we were working on. So in that sense, the idea of an initial geometrical instance that helps you to control a larger degree of the project proved to be powerful. And then also with the pavilion in 2009, where we then combined it with bilateral symmetry. So there we have a combination of rotational symmetry and bilateral symmetry. So it's a pentagon-shaped building that revolves around a tree, literal a pivot, and it shows with each and every column, it shows a bilateral symmetry. So there was the combination of those symmetrical systems of order, or systems of symmetrical order, that would help to make the project buildable in the end, because you would break down the amount of different parts, which at that point in time, I think was important to get the project on site within the given time frame. So there is this fascination with the idea of the pivot as a geometrical and operational tool, but also as a, let's say, space-making tool. So the idea that, as in the Haus H, you see that there is a central space, and that central space is both part of the geometrical setup, and it is the central space. So same for the mosque. So the mosque space was a pentagon-shaped space where you would actually have a central pivoting point that would engender the geometry, but that would also make the space. So there's this fascination that I think started around 2003, 2004, and has left its traces up until today, interestingly.
Thank you, Holger. I think that following your answer, I would like to ask you a bit more on representation and on the role of representation and of the drawings in your practice. And in particular, for sure, it's clear from your lecture that drawing is very important in your practice and also in your teaching in Wuppertal. I was thinking before at the introduction of the last issue of OASE, OASE 105, which is exactly about the practices of drawing, and in particular about the classification that it's proposed at the beginning, quoting Francesco Dalcò and Robin Evans in particular, which divide drawing in two kind of families. So the drawing as a tool on one side, and the drawing as a painting on the other. So the drawing coming from the Renaissance tradition, an operative kind of drawing, and on the other, drawing coming from Beaux-Arts tradition till, let's say, and then to post-war, last century, post-war years, or post-modern, if we want to use this very problematic category, till contemporary design. I think that from your lecture, it's quite clear that you are using mainly the first kind of drawing among these two, which is also maybe the one we can associate to associative and parametric design. You anyway showed also two collages, the one by St. Jacob and by Young and Ayata, referring to the idea of context. My question would be to, if you could please tell us if and eventually how also this second kind of drawing, so the collage, has a direct role in your practice.
I think that is an interesting case, because I think 15 years ago I would only have talked about the drawing as an operational tool. So I had a slide for my lectures that would compare an elevation drawing with a spline drawing of a ship. And I would use that to basically explain the potential of operational drawing. But I think, and for sure we still have that in the office because we need that to produce a project. But then on the other side, and I would link that, you could say, to the use of digital geometry, maybe to the realm of what has been called simulation. So these are 3D tools that or 3D objects that we render that in the end, or that are meant to basically simulate a reality that's going to come, which is the building. And then on the other side, I think we have the same tools. So whether it's the rendering tool, meaning pixel image, but we also use all sorts of drawing techniques to explore and speculate. And in that sense, I'm really happy that we have these two cornerstones. One would be, you'd say, the operational, and the other would be the speculative. And in that sense, I think we have tried to explore more and more drawing techniques in relation to simulation tools. So, while on the one side, I think we hint for reality that is the building. On the other side, we produce a reality in its own, which is the image. That is, and in that sense, I'm happy to have the, you'd say, platform at the university, because I would argue we use the university not in the sense of as a preparation for a building to be built, but to produce its own reality. So any VR project, any drawing that we do is a project in its own end. So it is not necessarily hinting at a building to come, because at the university we don't build. So we use those drawing techniques, I would say, as a reality in itself. What we have not managed, I would say, so far is basically bringing that back into the office, which I think also in the end has to do with simply time. But that is something I think we should or need to explore much more clearly in how, for instance, the techniques that we have learned and developed at the university could help us to, again, reread projects and also procedures that we have at the office. In that sense, I think we are much more pragmatic when it comes to the use of geometry at the office than we are at the university.
So maybe I may add, Holger, because you seem to suggest that there is indeed a sort of productive relation, let's say, between what Filippo Catapanes called indeed the drawing as a tool and the drawing as a painting, just to use your two categories. So the drawing is something more instrumental, operative on the one hand, and on the other hand, the drawing is like Canaletto was doing indeed, imagining a sort of a field of let's say speculation and exploration. I would say as well. What might be, let's say, the productiveness of that slippage, of that reciprocity between the two? Because you seem to suggest it in your answer right now. What could be gained from them? Because there are two ways of knowing, let's say, one more operative, the other one more speculative, let's say. But what could be gained of the reciprocity between these two ways of knowing that we find in the drawing?
I mean, what I find interesting is that you would say the operational drawing today is not a drawing, but it's a model, right? It's all 3D modeling. We pretend that we are drawing, but in fact we're building data. So when we enter the act of drawing, that's, I think, again, a deliberate artistic act where we evaluate that data and then transform it into reality in itself. And I think what I hope what this will help us to do is to create aesthetic input for the office again. So to basically help steering the aesthetics and formal interests of the office if we, let's say, start processing our projects through such a filter, where we, let's say, use the geometries and the data that we produced for building buildings for more explorative, in more explorative cases. And then ideally we will explore aesthetics or typologies, things like that, that will help us to, when we get the next project, steer the project in a slightly different way again.
I think it's a very interesting claim that you're making right now, that these two, let's say, ways of knowing, or the complementarity between these two ways of knowing, also seems to hold a certain kind of criticality, even I would say as well. At least that's how I'm interpreting what you are saying right now. I think for our thinking about what tacit knowledge is, how it functions, let's say in this case in two types of drawings, or I think is a very interesting. I'm giving back the word to Filippo, maybe for an additional question.
Yes, I was thinking that in a way also your attitude in relation to drawing, so the fact that you are trying to use both these kind of categories of drawings, as we were saying, could also lead us to another very crucial, I think, aspect of your design approach, which I would say it's hybridity. I think that from your presentation appears quite clear your attempt to put together let's say tradition and modernity at many different levels. So we could say from the application of associative tools, associative processes, but also together with typological kind of analysis. But we could see the same also at the level of construction, as you were showing, also in the facade drawings, and also in the, we could say, in the materiality, in those bricks, white bricks that you were mentioning. And I think it's also the same thing you were considering about symmetry, this rotational symmetry, which is, let's say, a real symmetry which is hiding behind a more dynamic kind of appearance, and which is actually something that it appears quite clear also in the way your projects are photographed and represented. My question is, I would like to ask you if this kind of attitude was present since the beginning in your practice, or if there was a more gradual, let's say, evolution. And I would also ask you which kind of connection you see between this attitude and the context in which you are, you studied, you did your first professional, let's say, experiences, and in the context, in the German context, where you are now working and teaching?
Okay, that's a difficult one. I think coming back to Germany after the experience we had in Holland was for sure not very easy. Because we had to adapt to a very different way of designing, planning, building, and to entirely different topics. So you could say from the office in Holland, I came from a background where you would say newness was the main goal. So it was a deliberate avant-garde approach. Whereas I think building the office here, that approach would not have worked. So we tried that in the beginning, but I would just argue no one would be interested in a small office in Düsseldorf now claiming an avant-garde position. So we basically had to adopt to the reality of this place in a way, and there was both that hurt and was productive. Because I think it helped us to also deviate away from, let's say, our Holland experience and take a position that I, for myself, for today, would consider to be very productive. Because the notion of place, the notion of context, I think has not been that explicitly important before. And it is explicitly important now, since I would say around, maybe 7 to 8 years. It is, I think, a key interest that we have. But it is also for sure a certain idea of how architecture should be projective, how far it should try to hint beyond a place, hint beyond a specific situation, and also respond to contemporary interests that are not bound to a certain place. So there's a collision, you could say, of those interests. And what we try is we try to balance them. We try to produce a balance that you could call a hybrid. So, and what it does, it creates two things, I think. One is positive, the other is negative. The negative one, it is a sort of a misfit. It does not belong to either that school or that school of thought. It is something in between. So you could say about the house, it is not NURBS enough, and it is too much NURBS. So it is somewhere in between the schools of thoughts. So I think it's maybe hard to relate to a project like that. But on the other side, I would argue that it creates a certain moment of doubt, a certain moment of criticality. And that is something I'm really interested in. And I think that only comes from a hybrid position, because it needs to be similar enough to certain backgrounds or certain contexts, and it needs to be different enough to basically initiate that moment of doubt. Maybe that's a great hope for a small house, but I can say that for the house hire that we did, this sort of works. So people stand in front of it and they don't understand it. And the client is really happy that they don't understand it, because they don't get how large the house is. They don't. It's really hard to read the house. But it's also a critical comment on building in that region, on the role of the single family house and so forth, because it's so distorted and so weird.
I see that we're slowly running out of time, but I allow myself, maybe Holger, to ask a last question, and this would be a question on the role of typology. I mean, typology is one, of course, very, I think, important way of knowing from within the architectural discipline, the logos of types, let's say, the knowledge of types. And I was wondering, because when I'm looking at your practice and see on the one hand, I think a large respect for historical types and try and attempt to understand, to indeed know these types, let's say. But on the other hand, of course, I also see an operation which has to do with modification, transformation of the type as well. And I was wondering if you could say something about indeed the importance or the role of this very typical way of knowing in your practice, so this typological way of knowing.
Yeah, I mean, so the idea of typological research that is something that I think evolved around 2008 to 2010. That was a topic that was not at stake in Holland at all. So there you would use all sorts of mathematical models, things that come from outside the discipline, sort of. But while trying to understand this discipline, I thought that there's just extremely large potential in what is already there, what has been used, what has been developed so far. But what I did not like about the way I was taught typology at school was that it was always a reductive technique. So it was like a set space of references that you would use, that you would apply. And I thought that specifically the technology that we have and the thinking that is behind that, which is transformative, just explicitly transformative, helps to use typology as a projective and maybe as a projective strategy. So it's more a typology in the process of becoming than the typology as a set reference. It is more a model to be followed and less a type to be used, you could say.
So knowing that type, let's say, allows you to project things forward, to come up with new solutions as well. Is that what you're saying?
I would say so. When we did the mosque, we explored this hypostyle typology. We explored the central space, I mean, we could have just used them and applied them and modified them a bit, but we thought it would just be much more interesting to crossbreed them. And that is a sort of a nasty operation. But by crossbreeding them, I thought then something interesting and maybe new happened. However, it still relied on continuity. So it was not like something that came from the machine. It was not something that we just invented, but from that hybridization of typologies, something different emerged. And that, I think we really enjoyed that moment of emergence. The same with House B. For House B, we took a lot of, you could say, bourgeois housing typologies, and we just superimposed them, and then just saw what they would do. And then we processed them through a filter of geometrical transformation, which in the end, I would say, ended in a very rich living environment for the family. And I know from the family that they very much enjoy it because it's a really weird blend of, you would say, situations where the living is directly connected to the kitchen, to the dining, and so forth, but they are also all separated. And then there are these weird elements that connect them again. So it's a very ambiguous space that I think is engendered from that or is derived from that hybridization process. But yeah, typology is, I think, at stake there.
Yeah. Well, I think it's nice that in your answer, of course, we see how these logos of types connects in some kind of way the past to the future, I would say. And I think it's very typical for the position of a practitioner that creating this bridge is something very important. I see that we're already well over time, so I think that this is the moment to conclude. I mean, I would like to thank, of course, you, Holger Hoffman, for sharing so openly, I think, your practice with us and for discussing it. I would like to thank also Filippo Catapan for preparing the excellent questions. I think we were able indeed to explore some ways of knowing in the practice of Holger Hoffman. And I would of course also thank the audience for joining us. I would like to remind you that next week already we have our second TACK talk, and that is with the Swedish office of Sprit. So this is on the 28th of May, again from 6 to 7. And then my colleague Christophe Graaf will do the introduction. So thank you all for being with us, and well, looking forward to meet you or to e-meet you in a week's time. Thanks.